Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's go ahead and get Series 8 of today's Tolkien Times going. First, with a little update as to what to expect over the next 8 weeks. Now, first, I've received a lot of feedback on these Middle-earth Map Mondays, and everybody wants me to keep them going, so that's precisely what we're going to do on Mondays for at least one more series. Now, Tuesdays and Wednesdays will remain the usual, with a return to the letters on Tuesdays and my amateur philology attempts on Wednesdays. Thursdays will see us continue with the poetry and songs found in The Lord of the Rings. And then on Fridays, we're going to go back to the Lay of Lathian in First Age Fridays as we continue to work our way through the story of Beren and Luthien. Now finally, now that we're done with the tragic story of Aldarion and Erendis on Second Age Saturdays, we're returning to Silmarillion Saturdays. This time, as I read through Akallabeth, which should be particularly helpful to those of you still making your way through the Rings of Power TV show. So let's get started with Series 8 and Middle-earth Map Monday. Now, last week, we closed out Series 7 by looking at two of the successor kingdoms of Arnor, Rhudaur and Cardolan. I told you then that I'd run out of time to talk about the biggest and longest surviving of those successor kingdoms, Arthedain, and that I would return to it to start this series, so that's precisely what I'm doing. But before I do, I realize I never laid out the larger bounds of the original North Kingdom of Arnor. For that, I want to go to Appendix A1, little parentheses 3, on Eriador, Arnor, and the heirs of Isildur. Now, I'm going to be covering this entire portion of these appendices in greater depth in episode 347 of the Prancing Pony podcast, which will come out on November 3rd. But let's get at least a preview of that here. And that's where we read, Eriador was of old the name of all the lands between the Misty Mountains and the Blue. In the south, it was bounded by the Grey Flood and the Glanduin that flows into it above Tharbad. Now, we have to understand Eriador's geography to understand Arnor because of the next line. At its greatest, Arnor included all Eriador except the regions beyond the Lune and the lands east of Grey Flood and Loudwater, in which lay Rivendell and Hollin. So the first thing to remember is that Eriador is the geographical region, while Arnor is the northern kingdom. Now, there's a lot of overlap, as we'll see, but not entirely. Now, Eriador is described as the land between the Ered Luin to the west and the Misty Mountains to the east, while the southern border of it is the Grey Flood and its tributary, the Glanduin. So let's take a look at a map of Middle-earth, either in your book or at lotrproject.com. You'll see the big mountain ranges to the east and west. Let's start there. Now, since Eriador is only the land between these two ranges, that means that neither part of Lindon, that's Forlindon, the north, and Harlan on the south, which we covered last series, is part of Eriador. What the text calls the southern border is really a southeastern border for the most part. You'll see that where the Grey Flood runs southwest, reaching the sea just beyond the haven of Londair, splits Minhiriath and Enedwaith. Well, Enedwaith then, since it's to the south of the Grey Flood, is not part of Eriador, while Minhiriath, to the north of the river, is part of the region. Now, if you follow the Grey Flood up to Tharbad, where the north-south road crosses the river, you'll see that it's fed by the Bruinen, that's the Loudwater, and that continues in a straight line, essentially, to the northeast, and by the Glanduin, which goes due east. But it's the Glanduin that marks the rest of the southern border of Eriador, so that Eregion, to the north of Glanduin, is in the region, but Dunland, to the south of it, is not. And now that you, hopefully, have a clear picture of the geographical region of Eriador, we move to the Kingdom of Arnor's borders, and you'll see they overlap a lot, but not completely. The regions beyond the Lune were not part of Arnor. Now, the Lune is the river that runs mostly north-south between the Emin Uil, the hills of Evendim, and the Ered Luin, until it empties into the Gulf of Lune near Mithlond, the Grey Havens, and the Gulf itself runs east-west. So that means that the land between the Ered Luin and the River Lune were not part of Arnor. Also not part of Arnor, the lands east of Grey Flood and Loudwater. So go back to that map and look at where we describe the Glanduin as the southern border of Eriador. Now that little triangle-shaped wedge of land from Swanfleet at the southwest corner to Moria at the southeast corner and to Rivendell at the north tip is part of the region of Eriador but not part of the Kingdom of Arnor. That area includes Rivendell as well as the land of Eregion or Hollin, where the elves had a big presence in the Second Age under Celebrimbor in Ost in Edil. Now that you have Eriador and Arnor understood, let's finally lay out where Arthedain lay within Arnor. It's like a set of Russian nesting dolls. You've got a realm within a kingdom within a region. Now, the text says Arthedain was in the northwest and included the land between Brandywine and Lune, and also the land north of the Great Road as far as the Weather Hills. Now, those east and west borders seem pretty clear, but what to make of this slightly confusing part about the land north of the Great Road? Well, here we have to go back to the idea of the eastern border being the Brandywine. Look at the Brandywine south of the bridge and the Shire. It turns to the southwest and flows to the sea. It's that portion west of the Brandywine that belongs to Arthedain. But once you go east of the Brandywine, their region begins again at the road and extends north, with the eastern boundary of that northern portion being the Weather Hills. That's why Lake Evendim and Anuminus, Fornost, and the North Downs are all part of Arthedain, all the way up to the Bay of Foreshell. North from the Great Road and east as far as the Weather Hills. Now, for some very simple word nerdery, it's pretty straightforward. Sindarin for realm of the Edain, with the element Arth meaning region or realm, and Edain for, well, the Edain. Now, like we pointed out in the Middle-earth Map Monday on Rhudaur and Cardolan, Arthedain lasted longer than the other two. Rhudaur was under control of Angmar by 1356, when Argelib I, king of Arthedain, was killed in battle against them. And by 1409, Cardolan was all but gone. The plague in 1636 finished what was left of Cardolan. It was at this time that an end came of the Dunedain of Cardolan, and evil spirits out of Angmar and Rhudaur entered into the deserted mounds and dwelt there. Now, more than 300 years later, in 1974, the power of Angmar arose again, and the Witch King came down upon Arthedain before winter was ended. He captured Fornost, and drove most of the remaining Dunedain over the Lune. Among them were the sons of the king. But King Arvedui held out upon the North Downs until the last, and then fled north with some of his guard, and they escaped by the swiftness of their horses. And it's that part of the story of the end of Arthedain that we'll talk about next week when we visit Foreshell on another Middle-earth Map Monday. But folks, that wraps it up for Middle-earth Map Monday. Now, if you have a mailbag question you'd like me to answer in Series 9 or maybe 10, please email it to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Send it in and let them know it's for today's Tolkien Times. I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, I am grateful for the support of my patrons. You guys are the ones who make it possible for me to invest the time and resources into producing these episodes. Now, if you'd like to be a part of that, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to find out how you can join the TTT Content Council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. Now, join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.